At dinner, my son-in-law raised his wine glass and smiled like he'd just told a joke he assumed everyone would find clever. He leaned back and said, "So James, how does it feel to be a loser?" There was a brief silence. Then laughter, light, uncertain. My daughter Rachel gave him a look that tried to be playful, but I noticed how quickly her eyes shifted away. I smiled. Not because it was funny. Just because I didn't want to make anyone uncomfortable. Derek went on, "No, seriously. You used to be this big guy with your own company, right? Now you're just, what? Retired and reading newspapers?" I cut my steak calmly. "Something like that." I didn't respond the way he wanted me to. That much was clear. He liked sparring, especially when he felt sure he'd win. And lately, he'd been treating me like I was an old man who'd lost his edge, harmless, irrelevant, and past his prime. He wasn't entirely wrong. I was quiet now. I didn't correct people much. Didn't feel the need to list my accomplishments. I left that behind when I stepped away from the business. But irrelevant? No. That was something else. I passed the potatoes to Sophie, my 6-year-old granddaughter, and asked her about school. She smiled and launched into a story about a class turtle. And for the moment, that was enough. "My name is James. I'm 60. I've worked at Redbrook Freight for 34 years, most of them as its owner. I started that company when Rachel was in high school. She used to sit in the back office on Saturdays, coloring while I went over invoices. She knew what it took. Or at least, I thought she did. When I sold most of my stake a couple of years ago and handed off the reins, I did it quietly. I didn't make a big deal of it. I didn't need a retirement party. But I also didn't expect that the quieter I got, the more invisible I'd become. Rachel used to call me for advice. Now she called me to tell me what Derek said I should do. Derek liked to talk. Especially about startups, crypto, scaling fast, and whatever book was trending on business podcasts. He wore confidence like cologne, heavy, and meant for other people to smell. That night at dinner, I noticed something. Not the insult itself, that was too easy. But the way no one defended me. Not because they agreed, but because they didn't want to make it awkward. That's when I understood something important. I wasn't being challenged. I was being erased, gently, casually, by a man who thought he was smarter than everyone in the room. It didn't sting. Not in the way people expect. It was just, informative. People like Derek mistake kindness for weakness. Patience for irrelevance. They think silence means you've got nothing left to say. But I'd spent decades running a business that depended on timing, planning, and knowing exactly when not to speak. That night, I decided to listen more carefully. Not just to the words, but to what they believed about me, what they had stopped seeing. I didn't go home angry. I just sat with the facts. He saw me as someone finished. And he said it out loud. Not out of cruelty. But because he didn't think I could do anything about it. And that was his first mistake. It hadn't started with the dinner. That moment was just the one that made it undeniable, the point where I could no longer pretend I hadn't noticed. But in truth, Derek had been speaking to me like that for months. Not overt insults. Just comments that wore down the edges. Guess that generation didn't really think about scaling, he'd said once when we talked about business. Or, you guys were all about stability, not speed, right? I'd nod. Smile. Let it pass. Sometimes it's easier to let small things slide. You don't want to be the one who calls everything an insult. But when small things become a pattern, you realize you were never overreacting, just outnumbered. He never asked questions. Never wondered how I kept Redbrook alive through 3 recessions, or how I managed to pay every employee on time without missing a single cycle in 34 years. In his world, I was part of the past. A man who used fax machines and liked paper ledgers. He'd decided what I was, and nothing I said would change it. Rachel used to listen differently. When she was a teenager, she'd sit on the kitchen stool while I explained how to calculate margins or forecast demand. She was sharp, always was. She asked hard questions. Challenged my thinking. That was part of what made it all sting just a little more. She wasn't cruel. She never mocked me. But lately, she echoed Derek without realizing it. Phrases like, "That's just not how things are done now," started to slip into our conversations. There was a time she would have called me before making big decisions. Now, she called after, to inform me, not to ask. It's a strange thing, watching the respect drain out of a relationship in real time. It doesn't come with shouting or slammed doors. Just the soft closing of them. They weren't trying to push me out. That would have required intention. No, they were just forgetting to include me. Assuming I didn't have much left to offer. Derek was the kind of man who filled space. His voice was always the loudest in the room, even when he spoke softly. People deferred to him, not because he'd earned it, but because he expected it. That kind of confidence isn't built on depth. It's built on momentum. And when a man like that marries your daughter, you start noticing the small shifts. Like how your name is left out of a story you were part of. Or how your past advice becomes something my dad used to say, not something worth remembering. I don't blame Rachel. Not entirely. She's building a life of her own. And I want that for her. But there's a difference between moving forward and leaving someone behind. What got me wasn't that Derek underestimated me. It was that Rachel did too, without realizing she had. I didn't say anything. I didn't confront either of them. That's not how I operate. But I started to pay closer attention. I watched how Derek talked about risk, like it was a badge, not a responsibility. I noticed how quick he was to dismiss caution, how easily he confused speed with strategy. He liked the sound of success more than the work behind it. And he assumed anyone who wasn't talking like him must not have had it. He never asked why I left Redbrook. I didn't retire because I was tired. I left because I'd spent 3 decades building something solid, and I wanted to hand it off while it was still healthy. I had enough. More than enough. But Derek didn't know that. And more importantly, he didn't care to ask. That was what stayed with me after the dinner, not the words, but the carelessness behind them. They weren't trying to hurt me. They just stopped seeing me. And in their minds, that was harmless. That's what made it interesting. When Rachel was born, I was still working nights in a warehouse, back when Redbrook Freight was just an idea and a worn-out clipboard. I remember standing in our kitchen at 4 a.m., holding her in one arm and pouring coffee with the other. Laura used to joke that Rachel was the only baby in the world who knew the smell of shipping pallets before she could crawl. We didn't have much then. Just enough. But what we had was earned. Every bill paid, every hour worked. There's a kind of pride that comes from building a life like that, not loud pride, not something you wear on your sleeve. Just a quiet kind that sits in your chest and reminds you what matters. Fatherhood, for me, was never about big gestures. It was about steadiness. About being the person who always showed up. I didn't miss birthdays. I didn't disappear when things got hard. I just kept going. That was the job. I used to drive Rachel to school in the mornings, even when I had 3 hours of sleep and back-to-back calls waiting. She'd talk the whole way, about teachers, homework, stories she was writing in her head. She used to say, "Dad, when I grow up, I want to be in charge of something too." I told her, then pay attention to the people who don't talk about being in charge. They're the ones doing the real work. That kind of thing stuck with her back then. But lately, I could see those values shifting in her, not because she stopped believing in them, but because Derek replaced them with noise. He talked about momentum, branding, velocity. Words that sounded sharp but meant nothing on their own. And Rachel started repeating them. Not all at once, but gradually. Like the way a song gets stuck in your head after hearing it in the background long enough. I sat with that for a while. Derek had never once asked about the company I built. Not even in passing. He didn't know what I did to keep it afloat when our largest shipping contract collapsed in 2008. He didn't know I once personally delivered freight overnight just to meet a deadline for a client I couldn't afford to lose. He didn't know any of it, because he never asked. To him, I was a former business owner, not someone with lessons worth learning. And maybe more than that, he never respected the kind of success that didn't come with headlines or public praise. What he didn't understand was that I hadn't built Redbrook to impress anyone. I built it to keep promises. To provide. I don't say that to claim nobility. I say it because that's what fatherhood was to me, a long, steady line of decisions made in silence. You go to work. You come home. You teach by doing. You don't ask for applause. You just hope they notice the kind of man you were. And for a long time, I thought Rachel had noticed. But the past few months had shown me something else. She saw Derek's ambition and mistook it for leadership. She saw my quiet and mistook it for absence. It's hard to accept that your daughter, the person you spent your whole life protecting, now sees you as someone whose time has passed. Not because she stopped loving you. But because she started measuring value by volume. Derek was louder. More confident. More visible. And in their world now, that seemed to count for more. Still, I didn't say a word. Not because I was afraid. But because I'd been a father long enough to know that some truths aren't taught through speeches. They're learned through time. Through consequences. Through quiet revelations that arrive when the noise dies down. So I waited. And while I waited, I watched. Because being underestimated doesn't bother me. Being forgotten, that's what sharpens the edge. A few weeks after that dinner, Derek made a passing comment that stayed with me longer than I expected. We were standing in the backyard while Sophie played with bubbles near the garden hose. He asked if I missed working, then smirked before I could answer. I guess it's nice, he said, getting out before the real shifts in the industry started. I mean, most guys your age don't really keep up once things go digital. I didn't correct him. There was no reason to. Letting people stay comfortable in their assumptions can be a useful thing, if you know how to use it. Derek had his version of my story. In his mind, I'd run a small company for a while, then stepped away because I was either too tired or too far behind. He probably imagined I spent my mornings reading the paper and my afternoons checking coupons for early bird dinners. It never occurred to him that I'd left Redbrook on my terms, not because I was finished, but because I'd built it to a point where it could run without me. When I founded the company, I didn't have a mentor or an investor or a launch deck. I had a truck, a garage, and 3 clients who believed in my word. From there, I built something that lasted. Not flashy, not massive, but stable. We handled specialty freight and contract logistics. Niche work. Unlikely to make headlines, but steady enough to pay everyone fair wages and carry long-term clients through economic storms. When I handed off the company 2 years ago, I didn't sell it in full. I kept a quiet share, just enough to maintain a window into the numbers. The man I left in charge, Martin, had been with me for 20 years. He wasn't loud, but he was capable. Thoughtful. The kind of person who reads every line of a contract twice before signing. Derek didn't know Martin. He didn't even know Redbrook still existed. That assumption, that I was retired, done, coasting, that became useful. Because it's easier to observe when people stop seeing you as part of the game. And I was starting to think Derek had no idea what game he was even playing. He talked about disruption, scalability, exit velocity. He used those phrases as if they guaranteed substance. But real businesses, the ones that endure, they're built on quieter things: timing, trust, discipline. Knowing when to say no, when to hold, when to pivot slowly. Derek had none of that. What he had was charisma, momentum, and an audience that hadn't seen him lose yet. But I'd seen what happens when people like that hit turbulence. They look around for someone to blame. And they always expect someone else to fix the damage. So I started asking a few casual questions. Rachel mentioned Derek was working on something big. A logistics-adjacent platform with a tech angle, built for modern supply chains. I nodded. Asked where they were getting their funding from. She said Derek had a few early-stage investors and was putting together a second round. He was proud of how fast the valuation was growing, already in the low 8 figures, apparently. Interesting, I said. That's all. But that conversation stayed with me. Derek thought I was finished. He thought I didn't understand the world he operated in. But logistics is still logistics, whether it's trucks or tracking software. And if he was building something in my old backyard, then he was walking straight into a space I knew far better than he did. Quietly, I reached out to Martin. We met for coffee, like we'd done 100 times before. I think I have an idea, I said. He nodded. He didn't need the whole story. Sometimes trust doesn't require explanation. By the end of the hour, we had a simple understanding. Let Derek keep assuming. Let him think the old man was out of the picture. I had no interest in stopping him. I just wanted a front row seat. It's strange how much people will tell you when they assume you're not listening. Or when they think you're no longer relevant enough to understand what they're saying. I'd sit there, at family dinners, barbecues, birthday gatherings, smiling, nodding, making quiet observations while Derek talked like I was a forgotten piece of furniture in the room. He'd speak freely around me now. Sometimes even about me. I could tell he had started to enjoy this power shift, this imagined superiority. There was something smug in the way he leaned back in his chair, or laughed just a bit too loud when someone mentioned investments or business. And I noticed, he no longer looked at me as someone he needed to impress. Just someone he'd already won against. That suited me fine. I didn't react. Not to his jabs. Not to the way he interrupted me when I spoke. Not even when he made little comments to my daughter like, "Your dad's still stuck in his old school ways." Huh. Instead, I asked small questions. Harmless ones. Casual ones. Like, still working on that startup you mentioned? Or, how's the fundraising going? Derek liked to talk about himself, a lot. He thrived on the attention, even when it came from me. Maybe especially when it came from me. He saw my interest as admiration. Validation. And because he believed I was just an aging man desperate to understand the modern world, he over-explained everything. That's how I learned his little project was more than just an idea. He'd registered a company. Recruited a friend or two. Built a website. Started putting together a deck for angel investors. Apparently, he was going to revolutionize logistics. I listened to the pitch twice, once over dinner, and once when he forced it on me during a car ride, and both times, I smiled politely and said it sounded promising. He never once asked what I thought. Not really. He just wanted someone to listen while he painted himself as a visionary. So I let him. My daughter didn't say much about it. She looked tired more often now. Stressed. But when I asked her how things were going, she'd just shake her head and say, "It's been a lot. He's working constantly." There was a weariness in her voice, but no bitterness. Not yet. I started noticing other things too, small, quiet things. Derek had stopped wearing his wedding ring. He said it made his finger itch. He started taking more networking trips. Twice, I saw him send messages on his phone and quickly lock the screen when I walked past. Again, I said nothing. There's something powerful about withholding a reaction. Most people rush to respond, defend, argue. But silence creates discomfort, and in that discomfort, people reveal more than they intend to. One night, Derek mentioned casually that he was looking for capital, just a small raise from family and friends. Nothing big, he said. Just enough to get through this next stage. You know how it is when you're bootstrapping. I nodded and asked what kind of returns he was projecting. He grinned. Huge. I mean, if we scale the way I think we will, early investors could see 10x. He didn't ask me directly to invest. But he hovered there, waiting, hoping I'd offer. I didn't. Instead, I asked how much he'd raised so far. He lied, I knew it, because his friend Matt had already told me over drinks that they'd barely gotten commitments. But I let Derek talk. I smiled. I said, "It sounds like you're onto something." And then I changed the subject. I began keeping notes. Just brief things. Names, dates, pieces of the puzzle. Not because I was building a case, but because memory fades, and I needed everything to be precise. And in the quiet of those weeks, something started to settle in me. Not revenge. Not anger. Just clarity. Derek was building something flimsy. Rushed. Shaky. He didn't need to be taken down, he just needed room to collapse on his own. And I'd be there, patient and quiet, when he did. Oh, before I forget, if you've made it this far, I appreciate you. Stories like mine aren't flashy, but sometimes the quiet ones teach us the most. If you're enjoying this, feel free to subscribe or give it a like. I won't ask twice. Anyway. I didn't warn my daughter. Not yet. Not because I didn't care, but because warning her too soon would make her defend him. I needed her to see it on her own. People don't change their minds because you tell them to. They change when something breaks and they have to decide what to do with the pieces. So I waited. And I watched. And Derek kept talking. It was subtle, the way the balance began to shift. Derek still greeted me like a man who had already won, with that overly casual, victorious tone that young men use when they assume age has made you slow. He'd slap my shoulder and say things like, "You're looking sharp, Pops," or "Still driving that old Lexus," as if I hadn't noticed the digs beneath the surface. But I kept my responses measured. Neutral. Just enough interest to keep him talking. By then, I knew nearly everything I needed to know about the app he was building. A clumsy mix of AI-powered inventory management and last-mile logistics. From what I could gather, he'd cobbled it together using a couple of offshore developers, one ex-college roommate with half a CS degree, and a branding consultant his cousin recommended. The pitch deck was polished, but the back end? Sloppy. Derek was too proud to notice he'd shown me his hand. He talked freely about fundraising, how hard it was to get early capital, how most VCs didn't get the vision, and how he was looking for strategic investors who could offer more than money. I nodded, gave him small affirmations. Sometimes I asked questions, the kind that made him feel like a teacher. How are you structuring your equity pool, or what's your current burn rate? It flattered his ego to explain things to me, the old man, just trying to keep up. But what he didn't know was that I'd been on the logistics side of business long before he ever learned how to spell angel round. I'd run regional hubs, optimized distribution networks, negotiated freight contracts across 3 continents. Derek thought I was the dinosaur. What he didn't realize was that I understood the terrain he was walking on far better than he did. And I had something he didn't, patience. One evening, over dinner, he floated the idea. "Actually," he said, swirling his wine, "I've been thinking, someone like you could be a good advisor, even an investor. You've got experience, connections. Might be a win-win. I kept my fork steady. What makes you think I'd be useful? He grinned, confident. Because you're smart enough to see this thing is going to explode. And you probably want to leave something behind, right? Legacy investment. Legacy. That word hung in the air longer than he intended. I looked over at my daughter, who was laughing at something Derek's brother had just said. She hadn't looked at me once since we sat down. Not once. That told me everything I needed to know. I smiled politely. Let me think about it. He leaned back like he'd already closed the deal. What Derek couldn't see, or chose not to, was that the leverage had already started tilting. I'd quietly reached out to someone I trusted from my Fairburn days, a compliance auditor named Imani, sharp as glass and discreet as a vault. I asked her to look into the app, the code base, the corporate filings, anything she could legally access. She found cracks. Licensing issues. GDPR violations. A few NDA-bound contractors he hadn't properly paid. It wasn't enough to take him down, yet. But it was a start. And while Derek was focused on fundraising, I was focused on positioning. I sent a message to an old colleague who now worked at Arcadia Ventures, the same firm Derek had been pitching. I didn't badmouth him. I just asked, have you done diligence on the founders behind Limino? That was enough to spark curiosity. My name still held weight in some circles. I wasn't out to ruin him impulsively. That would have been too easy. I wanted the floor to shift beneath him slowly, like ground eroding under a house. So that by the time he noticed, it would be too late to reinforce the foundation. I didn't tell anyone what I was doing, not even my daughter. Especially not her. Let them believe I was quiet because I was irrelevant. That's the kind of miscalculation you don't correct. You let it grow. And as the days passed, Derek grew more comfortable. More confident. He even started sending me pitch materials unprompted, investor briefs, MVP screenshots, emails with subject lines like opportunity for aligned growth. Each one, he thought, was a breadcrumb toward a deal. He didn't realize they were pieces of a puzzle I was quietly assembling, a map of his overreach, his recklessness, and eventually, his fall. I was no longer observing. I was preparing. And as I'd learned over decades in operations, timing is everything. The day you act isn't the day you win. It's the day they finally realize you were never out of the game. Derek never noticed how quiet I'd become around him. That's the thing with people like him, they confuse silence for submission. They think if you aren't interrupting, challenging, or making noise, you must be beneath them. What they don't realize is that silence has its own language. And I'd grown fluent in it. By then, I had already reviewed the public registration of Derek's company, a digital logistics platform he was calling Streamline West. I found the documents online with relative ease. They listed him as CEO, sole founder, and desperately underfunded. That much was obvious from his investor materials. He was overpromising, underdelivering, and leaning heavily on buzzwords he didn't understand. He hadn't asked me to invest yet, but I knew he would. I also knew he thought I would say yes. After all, I was just the quiet old man at the end of the table, the one he could mock in front of his friends because I folded my napkin instead of raising my voice. The truth is, I didn't need to destroy Derek. He was already building the fire. I just needed to hand him a match and wait for the right moment to light it. One afternoon, while dropping off something for my daughter, I accidentally left behind a printed portfolio I'd put together. It looked like investment notes, market comparisons, basic logistics performance data, and a fake summary of a small consulting firm I claimed to be helping on the side. Sure enough, the next day, Derek called. He didn't mention the folder directly. Instead, he launched into a long, rambling story about how the logistics space is ripe for disruption, and how he just needed one or two early believers to give him momentum. He talked like a man who thought he was saying something brilliant, but it was all cobbled together from LinkedIn posts and half-listened podcasts. I told him I'd be happy to take a look. That weekend, he came over with his laptop and pitch deck. I made coffee and sat across from him at the dining table. He spoke for 45 minutes straight, barely letting me ask a question. And when I did, he brushed them off. "I get it," he said, laughing. "You're from the old school. But this is different. This is about speed and scale, not warehouses and forklifts." I just nodded. After he left, I made 2 calls. The first was to a friend of mine in private banking. The second was to a former colleague who had become a venture analyst. I wasn't asking for favors, just facts. And what I learned confirmed everything I suspected. Derek had already burned 2 potential investors by exaggerating his user metrics. Worse, he had no functional platform, just a prototype with a broken back end. He was, in every sense, overleveraged. But I didn't tell my daughter. I didn't warn her. Not yet. A week later, I invited Derek for lunch, just the 2 of us. I told him I was intrigued by what he'd built, but I had a few conditions before I'd consider investing. He lit up like a child. "Of course, name it." I told him I wanted to bring in a friend of mine to do a quiet due diligence check, not a formal audit, just a second set of eyes. I said it casually, like I didn't expect him to object. And he didn't. His ego wouldn't let him. He was already imagining the money in his account. "Bring whoever you want," he said. "You'll see. I'm the real deal." That was the moment I knew he had no idea who he was dealing with. In his mind, he had me. I was his next investor, the naive father-in-law who would bankroll his startup so he could pretend he built something from scratch. He didn't see the trap because I wasn't angry. I wasn't confrontational. I smiled, I nodded, and I asked easy questions. He thought I was harmless. So I leaned in. I called my analyst friend again and gave him access to everything Derek had shown me. I asked for a quiet, thorough report, no flags, no official filings. Just truth. It came back uglier than I expected. Derek hadn't just exaggerated, he'd lied. Fabricated revenue projections, forged letters of intent from fake partners, and even altered timestamps on internal documents. I printed the report and slipped it into my drawer. I didn't need to act right away. Not yet. He was still building the fire. All I'd done was fan the flames. And Derek? He had no idea his match was already lit. I didn't gloat. I didn't need to. By the time the dust began to settle, everything was already in motion, quietly, methodically, and without a single confrontation. Derek had no idea that the family friend who backed out of his investment deal had only done so after a private coffee with me, in which I politely advised caution, not with slander, but with facts. A few questions here, a nod there. Just enough to seed doubt in the right minds. It was all it took. He didn't suspect that the senior executive he tried to court for a logistics contract was once a junior manager under me, someone who still remembered how I treated people with fairness and follow through. That contract never even reached the negotiation stage. What Derek never learned, and what I never offered, was that every time he tried to rise, I was already waiting above, gently removing the next rung from his ladder. I never shouted. I never revealed myself. The bank rejection came as a shock to him. His startup's funding dried up almost overnight. By the time he realized no one else was answering his calls, the reputation damage was already done. Quietly, behind closed doors, his name had come to mean reckless risk. I never lied about him. I never had to. I just told people to look closer. And they did. Leah came to visit me not long after. Alone. Her voice had changed, softer, unsure. She said she'd been meaning to check in. "Are you okay?" she asked. "I know you've been distant." I nodded. "I'm okay. You?" She hesitated. "Derek's having a rough time. Business stuff. I won't bore you." She wanted to say more. I could feel it sitting in her throat like a stone. But I let the silence do its work. "I think, maybe I made a mistake," she finally said. "You didn't deserve what happened. I see that now." I looked at her, my daughter, still proud, still uncertain. I didn't comfort her. I didn't scold her. I simply said, "Thank you for saying that." Because I had nothing to prove anymore. Later that month, I received a call from Derek. He didn't ask how I was. He didn't pretend to care. He got right to the point, in his usual way. "Look," he said, "I'm trying to pivot. There's a chance to reset things. But I need a partner who understands the game. Someone with stability. With legacy. People still trust you. We could." I let him speak for a while. I let him pitch. When he finally stopped, I said one word. "No." He waited. "No." "What? You're not interested?" "No, Derek. I'm not interested. I never was." Silence. Then he chuckled. "So that's it? All this time, and you're just gonna hang me out to dry?" I leaned back in my chair. "You hung yourself, Derek. I just didn't stop you." He muttered something under his breath. Then he said it again, louder. "You think you've won something? You think this makes you better than me?" I took a breath. Slow. Even. This isn't about winning. It never was. It's about knowing who I am. And never letting someone like you convince me otherwise. And I ended the call. No raised voices. No final blow. Just quiet truth. That's the part most people don't understand about revenge. It doesn't have to be loud. It doesn't need an audience. The most complete revenge is being at peace, while the person who wronged you scrambles to rebuild something they never truly earned. I didn't get my old family back. That part was never in my control. But I got something better, clarity. Stillness. And the quiet power of knowing I never became like him, even when I had every reason to. So when people ask me now how I managed to stay so calm, I just smile and say, some things crumble all on their own. You just have to know when not to catch them. There's a moment, right before a man realizes he's lost, when you can almost see the recognition pass through him. It's not panic. It's not anger. It's stillness. A flicker in the eyes, the breath that doesn't come. I saw that look on Derek's face last week, and I have to admit, it was quieter than I imagined. Fitting. After Derek had pitched me his venture for the third time in as many months, I told him I'd think about it. I said it like I meant it, not with excitement but with the steady tone of someone who was genuinely weighing his options. I'd learned that men like him preferred the illusion of control. He liked to believe he was the one nudging me forward, not the other way around. Of course, I never intended to invest in his company. But I made sure to ask him the right questions, the kind that sounded supportive. Who's handling your accounting? What's your burn rate? Are you looking at acquisition possibilities? He always answered quickly, eager, proud of himself. I let him believe I was on his side. That's the most generous thing I've done in years. I didn't need to dig for the truth. It came to me. His co-founder reached out indirectly, through a contact at my old firm. A small concern, he said. Some of Derek's numbers weren't aligning with their projections. He was overspending. Or maybe just overpromising. Either way, cracks were showing. I stayed out of it, officially. But privately, I asked my contact to listen closely and keep notes. Around that time, Emily stopped talking to me altogether. We shared space, not conversations. She moved through the house like she was avoiding a shadow. I didn't press. I didn't ask her about Derek or the venture or the strain I could see tightening in her posture. That would have been too obvious. Instead, I asked her how her garden was doing. I told her the front hedge was looking overgrown. I mentioned that I liked her hair pulled back. She didn't respond, but she heard me. That was enough. I could have accelerated things. I had the means to shut Derek down publicly. But this wasn't about force. It was about sequence. Timing. Humiliation isn't a single moment, it's a string of small defeats, each one unnoticed until the thread snaps. When the announcement came out, Derek's company was being investigated for misreporting early investor funds. It wasn't a scandal. Not loud. Just a quiet leak, passed around in the right rooms. The kind of news that makes real money step back and real reputations shrink. He didn't know I was connected to the man who'd pulled the thread. He still doesn't. He probably thinks it was a clerical mistake. Or maybe he's blaming one of his partners. That's fine by me. A few nights ago, they invited me to dinner again. Emily had that same strained look around the mouth. Derek poured wine like he was trying to stay relaxed. We talked about the weather. Retirement. Market volatility. Then he said something he shouldn't have. He said, "You know, it's a shame you never found your footing after the merger. You had potential." Emily looked down at her plate. I smiled. Not big, just enough. And I said, "How does it feel, Derek?" He blinked. Feel? To be building something you think you own, only to realize it was borrowed time all along? He set his glass down. I'm not sure what you mean. I tilted my head slightly. I think you are. We sat in that silence for a long second. Emily got up and started clearing plates. Her hands were shaking. Derek looked at her, then back at me. You're enjoying this, aren't you? No, I said. I'm remembering it. That's different. The next day, I received a call from the bank manager overseeing the trust I'd quietly pulled from Derek's second-round funding pool. He confirmed the transfer was complete, and the remaining investors had been notified. My name wasn't on any paperwork. My fingerprints were nowhere near the board. But the message was received. I left a small envelope in Emily's mailbox the following morning. No letter. Just a copy of her prenuptial agreement. She wouldn't remember it, Derek had insisted on handling the paperwork. Inside, I'd circled a clause in blue ink, any asset acquired through undisclosed family connections is subject to individual review. I had that clause added the day before their wedding. Quietly. Legally. I haven't heard from either of them since. That's fine. I don't expect apologies. I don't need them to fall apart in front of me. All I needed was for Derek to realize he never had the upper hand, not with me, not with her, not even with his own future. And I needed Emily to understand that trust is a gift. One you don't get back once you hand it to someone who laughs in your face. Sometimes, revenge isn't a fire. It's a quiet handshake you don't remember giving until it's too late to pull your hand back. Derek kept trying to contact me in the days after the board's vote. Texts, emails, a few polite voicemails that got more clipped each time. I didn't respond. The part of him that had always underestimated me now seemed frantic to rewrite the ending he hadn't seen coming. I suppose it's disorienting, being outmaneuvered by someone you thought was disposable. The rest of the family had started to sense something had shifted. Linda was quiet, careful with her words, like she wasn't sure which version of me she'd be speaking to next. I didn't give her a different version. Just the same one I always had, polite, calm, and observant. But now I was no longer in the room as a bystander. I was the one with the reins, and everyone could feel it, even if they didn't know what had changed. I got a letter from the old property lawyer, the one Derek had tried to use to shift ownership of the villa. The man apologized, somewhat nervously, for having misunderstood the intent behind Derek's earlier request. Of course, no official transfer had ever gone through. The lawyer was happy to confirm in writing that the property remained mine. I smiled reading that. I wasn't smiling out of spite. Just relief. Not at keeping the villa, but at confirming something deeper, that my quiet effort had outlasted their noisy schemes. The villa sat untouched for weeks. Derek and Isla no longer visited. I'd noticed they'd stopped hosting friends there too. Something about the place must have felt different now, less like a prize, more like a reminder. And I liked that. Sometimes the best kind of revenge isn't loud or punishing. It's simply showing someone that you were never theirs to play. I began clearing out some of my old files. Not out of bitterness, I just knew that soon, I'd be stepping back more publicly. I didn't want to leave a mess for someone else to decipher. In one folder, I found an old photo of Isla when she was 12, standing beside me at one of the early warehouses we opened in San Pedro. She was holding a clipboard I'd given her to make her feel included. She looked proud. Confident. Like the world was wide open and hers for the taking. I paused for a while, looking at that photo. I wasn't trying to feel anything specific. But something in me softened. Not toward who she'd become, but toward the memory of who she had been. A girl who once believed I was worth impressing. Still, nostalgia doesn't rewrite choices. I placed the photo back in the folder and sealed the box. At the next board meeting, I formally announced my retirement as managing partner. There was no drama. I'd prepared the succession plan months ago. Walter, my longtime associate, would be stepping in, someone Derek hadn't bothered to acknowledge in all his pitch meetings. The board was pleased. They'd seen enough over the past few months to trust the transition. After the meeting, Walter asked if I wanted a farewell event. I declined. I didn't need a send-off. Just clean lines and a clear end. A few days later, I invited Derek to the villa. I told him it was a personal matter, no lawyers, no advisors. Just us. He arrived looking cautious. Smiling, but not with his usual confidence. More like someone trying to read a room that no longer answered to him. I made tea. We sat out on the patio. You know, I said, this place always felt too big for me and Margaret. We liked the quiet corners, not the grand parts. He nodded, not sure where I was going. I used to think I'd leave this house to Isla. Let it become part of her life. Part of what we built. He shifted a little, bracing. But then I realized something. I set my cup down. Legacy doesn't mean giving people what they want. It means choosing what endures when you're no longer there. He stayed silent. I'm donating the villa, I said, evenly. There's a foundation that restores historical homes into community learning centers. They've agreed to turn this one into a public archive on architectural history and urban development. It'll bear Margaret's name. Derek blinked. He wasn't angry. Just thrown. She always wanted to teach. Thought about writing a book one day. This feels closer to her than anything else I could leave behind. He cleared his throat. You don't think Isla would've appreciated that too? I looked at him, really looked. She made her choices. So did you. I stood, handed him the last deed notice. Just wanted to let you know before it went through. There was nothing else to say. He left quietly. I stayed on the patio a while longer, letting the silence stretch. The air felt clearer. The house, no longer a battlefield, felt peaceful again. And as the sun dipped lower, I thought about how, in the end, the most lasting kind of revenge isn't one that ruins someone else's life, it's one that reclaims your own.